We're going to bring in Matthew Shribman now to discuss this. He's an award-winning science communicator and co-founder of Aim High Earth, speaking to us from Oxford in the UK. Matthew, welcome to this News Hour. Appreciate your time. Antonio
Hi there.
Guterres has really not been holding back. He has been an activist for climate change, for the climate crisis for a long time now. Do you agree with much of what he's saying, that the fossil fuel industry and its enablers, as he calls them, have a social and a special responsibility?
I think that the world has a social and special responsibility to keep itself in a livable state for future generations. The main thing causing the world to get uncontrollably hotter is fossil fuels. I think it's a difficult question to ask whether the fossil fuel industry are the best people to deal with that. I don't know if you've seen the North Atlantic temperature spike that's going on at the moment. It's crazy. It's completely off normal patterns. We've never seen anything like this before. We're seeing very hot weather across Europe at the moment, and I think it's fair to say that this is ultimately connected with what's going on with the emission of fossil fuels. And what I think it's very fair for the public to know is that the models that give us until 2050 to get to net zero, or 2053 in the case of Turkey, don't take collapsing nature into account. So when nature collapses, things get worse much faster. So imagine throwing a heater into a pond. It begins by getting warmer, quite predictably, but what happens when it gets so hot that the nature around it starts to die? The natural systems that hold the water in the pond, from the tiny, microscopic things through to the trees that are shading the pond. What happens when the pond gets so hot that they start to die? Once they die, the pond starts to dry up a whole lot faster. And this is the path that we're on with the whole world due to the burning of fossil fuels and also industrial scale animal farming, but that's another story. We already have 1 million species on the brink of extinction. 2053 is far too late. 2050 is far too late for us to get to net zero. The world of science understands this very, very clearly now.
So if it's not the fossil fuel industry who can actually bring about the real change that's needed, who's it up to?
So, one of the big problems is that the big fossil fuel companies are very profitable machines. They're making billions in profits from dumping dirty pollution into our shared air. The COP process, COP28, that looks like that's got quite close ties with the fossil fuel industry. So how can we trust that process? It's unreal how much CO2 they've pumped into the air now. Just as a quick side note, co2widget.com. My team and I put that together with the University of Cambridge just to give people some perspective on the enormous amount of fossil fuels that have been emitted now. But what we need is a ban on all new fossil fuel developments. But even that would still mean 10 years or so before we saw any decline at all if we didn't also start shutting down existing fossil fuel infrastructure. There are 7 times more fossil fuel assets that are now owned than can ever possibly be burnt without destroying a livable planet that can feed us and our children. Floods and fires and droughts, etc., are going to become the norm if we keep allowing this to happen.
And they
We will
already
all
feel like
this.
they are the norm. Sorry to interrupt you there, but you talk about floods and fires. We've seen that in the last few years. We're talking today about the cyclone in India, tornadoes, floods in the Balkans. All of that is now just becoming the norm. And I know people like you are trying to educate people about this. Is it also down to communities to do whatever they can to help the climate and help their own environments?
So individual change and systems change are 2 sides of the same coin. So when people change, the larger systems that they inhabit change as well. This is why it's so important that people do take on small changes themselves, but it's also important that those things are then met with politics that believes in its own people and wants to do the best for its own people, that helps to guide the system changes through as well. So to give you an illustration of how easily this could be fixed with some political changes, the world currently effectively subsidizes fossil fuels through our taxes into the trillions. Solar and wind are now cheaper in many places than fossil fuels. This is becoming an entirely political thing, that we're not making these switches. We're getting miles behind, and when I say we, I'm talking about Europe in general. We're getting miles behind China in this, whilst being sold the idea that China are the worst. Yes, China emits a lot of CO2 and the largest amount per country, but per person, they're emitting much less than Europe and most of the USA. Whereas if we can move more towards energy independence and safety for our families through moving towards renewables, then we could be leaders in this. And I would like to see a world in which I would like to grow up in a Europe that is a leader in solar and wind and these things that can move the dial very quickly away from fossil fuels.
Matthew Shribman, thank you so much for unpacking all of that for us live there from Oxford. Thanks, Matthew.